I recently heard a USA statistic shared at a church conference that 23% of American pastors at that conference would probably experience sabotage in the next 2 years. The pastor who shared that with me had just experienced his third coup, in which church staff and leadership maneuvered him out. He was broken and bruised, and he got me thinking of my own past conflicts in which people ask, "What's wrong with Larry?" But no one called the experiences sabotage. Diverse ministry opinions can lead people to painful conflicts, and conflicts can lead to sabotage. Pause this presentation now and read or listen to this passage in John chapter 11, verses 36 to 37, and then 45 to 57, where hostile religious leaders took desperate measures to shut down Christ's life-in-life ministry on earth. It is about sabotage. The 5 verses at the beginning of this passage in John chapter 11, verses 36 to 37, and then 45 and 46, reveal a variety of opinions. Some Jews marveled at the Lord's love for Lazarus. Some scoffed. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Some put their faith in Jesus. They actually began to trust him. But others went to the Pharisees and reported the event. It was this latter action that brought on the sabotage, which John followed now in his inspired record of Jesus in John chapter 11, verses 47 to 48. The awe-inspired, the scoffers, and even the believers were left out of the continuing record as the Holy Spirit showed how plans for Christ's death began to unfold. The religious leaders called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, consisting of 71 men who continually ensured the status quo of their religious positions and the cultural identities of the Jews within the Roman Empire. Most importantly, they defended their personal livelihoods as they discussed our holy place and our nation. Jesus was their greatest threat, and so conflict and sabotage were coming. A complex blending of religion and lifestyle occurred in these discussions in the Sanhedrin, and that is often the nature of sabotage that badly affects life-in-life ministry. The Sanhedrin was approved by the Roman Empire for oversight of everything Jewish, and that provided a certain lifestyle for these religious leaders. The religious body had to show strength to the Roman authorities, because weakness could lead to popular Jewish uprisings with people following public figures like Jesus. If law and order broke down among the Jews, Rome would blame the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas had been the high priest for 18 to 20 years by this time, so he thought he spoke for the preservation of everything Jewish in verses 49 to 52. He called attention to his own wisdom by mocking the foolishness of others, and then stated, "It is better for you that one man died for the people than that the whole nation perish." Forget the claims, the counterclaims, the rumors and conflicting opinions of the people. Their efforts to sabotage Jesus by challenging his words and authority, discrediting him before the people, had failed. Now their efforts to stop his miracles was confronted by this last miracle, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, with all of those witnesses watching. To resolve this crisis, Jesus must die. The Lord's so-called life-in-life ministry could be ended by simply removing his human life from the reckoning. Sabotage. Caiaphas did not want the temple destroyed by an unhappy Roman Empire, so the life of Jesus had to be removed. He did not want to lose his people to a man like Jesus. So in John 11, verses 53 to 57, the religious leaders plotted to arrest and kill Jesus. Their sabotage of the life-in-life way was adopting desperate measures. As far as Caiaphas was concerned, however, Jesus was sabotaging him and all religious authority. And that is the nature of such conflict. From the strictly human perspective, the question often becomes, who is sabotaging whom? Like others in Christian service, I have been sabotaged several times along the way, and I have probably been accused by others of sabotaging them. I never thought of these incidents as sabotage or coups until my colleague shared that USA statistic from a church conference, until he shared those painful experiences in his own life, and it brought back the pain of my own experiences. For me, I had simply seen such incidents as conflicts, unavoidable conflicts, intense conflicts, unresolved and divisive conflicts. They always left a sense of wounded failure and defeat in my life. But sabotage, coups? No. Those words never entered into my mind. The words to me were too worldly, too full of suspicion and fear. I did not dare call it sabotage. But whatever the label, one thing was sure. There was always a huge element of small life thinking, argument, rationalization, justification, ambition, and pride for both me and others. And that's where our experiences of such conflicts differ drastically from the Lord's experience. Our feelings of sabotage may be more closely related to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin than to Jesus. Why is that? Because our small life defenses are more like their small life defenses. Our human centeredness on such occasions is like theirs. We too may be fighting for religious legitimacy. Jesus, on the other hand, was different. He was not just one human life in contention with other human lives. He was God in contention with people. He fought for faith, not religious systems with their differing ranks. And in this, we see the huge difference between God's ways and ours. The Apostle John explained God's ways for Jesus back in verses 51 and 52. But this was not the young John who was a disciple standing by, uninspired and without God's life in his life. This was John in his 80s. John, 60 years later. John now inspired by the Holy Spirit. John with God's life in his life as he wrote these words by inspiration. John who had probably gone through a few sabotages and coups of his own during those 60 years. He explained that Caiaphas had actually and unwittingly prophesied that Jesus would die for the people. In fact, said John, he would die for the whole world. That death would bring all believers together, united in new life-in-life ways. Jesus would lay down his human life at the right time, and divine life would become available to all who believe. And that's the gospel. In actuality, then, everything that was being planned was working according to God's eternal gospel plan. They could remove the human life of Jesus, but they could not remove his divine life. In fact, the removal of human life would reveal Jesus as divine life in all of its glory. Their human-centered sabotage would result in God-centered salvation. And even the final verses of this passage in John 11, 54 to 57 point us to such a possibility. We are told that Jesus moved away from the public places and stayed near the desert in a place called Ephraim. That's about 12 miles north of Jerusalem. He did not stay to fight. He did not try to resolve the conflict between him and the religious leaders. He kept to his life-in-life message, ministry, and majesty. And that brings me to 3 lessons from the Lord's actions. Peace and reconciliation are today's messages when conflicts arise. Yet God's life in the equation is hardly considered. The Lord's actions make us realize that God's big peace is not possible where God's big life is not preeminent. God-centered reconciliation is not possible in conflict situations when human life predominates, whether in us or in others. God's life brings his big peace and his big reconciliation to the inadequate human standards of small peace and reconciliation. The lesson for us: keep to the message of life in life when confronted by conflict and sabotage. A second lesson can be extracted. When Jesus withdrew to an isolated place, he kept his eye on his ultimate life-in-life ministry. To see how he did so, we must divert from John's Gospel for a while to see what had previously transpired in such times when he had withdrawn from conflict. Before Jesus received the earlier message about Lazarus' illness, for example, his isolated time in Perea had been very busy. Luke chapter 13, verse 10, all the way to chapter 17, verse 10, provides the details, and they belong here. Jesus instructed people of the straight and narrow way. He dined with a Pharisee. He warned of the cost of discipleship. He told 5 familiar parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, the unrighteous steward, and the rich man and Lazarus. He offered warnings against causing others to stumble, failures to forgive, and false motives for service. And John had recorded that many believed because of those events in John 10, verse 42. So what is the lesson for us? It is to keep to life-in-life ministry when confronted by conflict and sabotage. There is no record of the Lord's actions or teachings during this second escape to an isolated place. Yet his upcoming journey to Jerusalem was going to again be filled with busy activity. Before he would get to the last Passover of his life, Jesus would heal the 10 lepers. He would teach about the coming of the kingdom. He would tell 3 more important parables: the persistent widow, the Pharisee and the commoner, and the parable of the vineyard. He would teach concerning divorce, bless children, and exhort the rich young ruler. He would foretell his suffering and passion. He'd rebuke the ambition of John and James. He'd heal blind Bartimaeus. And finally, he would go to the house of Zacchaeus, all in that very condensed time. You see, Jesus kept to his life-in-life ministry, and we must do the same in times of conflict and sabotage. A third lesson involved the disciples. In that remote place by the wilderness, crowds did not seemingly come to Jesus. In fact, they were on their way to Jerusalem instead to prepare for the Passover. Jesus was alone with the disciples, preparing them for a better understanding of life-in-life living in hostile, life-only environments. So what is the lesson for us? During times of conflict and sabotage, be drawn to the Lord's life-in-life majesty. In summary, we have drawn 3 lessons for times of conflict and sabotage from the example of Jesus. At such times, we need to, 1, keep to the life-in-life message, 2, keep to life-in-life ministry, and 3, be drawn to Christ's life-in-life majesty. So here's a reflective question as we conclude. How can the fact that God's life dwells in our lives during times of conflict take us beyond those conflicts and even sabotage?